New Year's Day, 1913. Dear Diary, today is the beginning of a whole new year. Of all the hurt, pain, and struggle of the previous year will now be forgotten. I will grieve for the rest of my life for the loss of so many lives on that night that the Titanic sank. How could something so tragic give a person something so good? Well, how can you be unhappy with a man that I didn't love on board, most beautiful ship in the world? Then suddenly, be with a man I love on the sinking ship. God knows, but for Jack, I am thankful. He's my one and only. I have just given under 2 weeks left until I am to bring my child into the world. The thought of child labor frightens me to the very soul. I'm still scared I'll fail, or something terrible will go wrong. But I pray every night until I give birth to a happy, beautifully healthy baby girl for Jack. He will be the most wonderful father. I have images of him donning his daughter and even be her daddy's little girl. The child's room is all ready, waiting for their arrival. We're just waiting on the 20th of January now so we can meet our sweet baby who has given me so much grief and sleepless nights through the kicking and squirming. It's certainly going to be a lovely child, and certainly we'll have our hands full, but it'll all be worth it. Rose Dawson. Closing her diary, Rose Dawson hoisted herself from the bed and placed the diary back on the shelf. She glanced over now her swollen stomach, was standing in the mirror at the bottom of her bed. Just thinking about it made her sick with excitement. But, still in the back of her mind, she was scared of failing. Scared of something would go wrong, or happen. She was also excited about the next part of her life, being a mother. But she sure would miss being pregnant, feeling her unborn child move vigorously inside her, causing her stomach to church with butterflies, and the feeling was incredible. Downstairs, New Year's cheer was counting. Jack was playing cards with Philip and with his brother Zach over for a cigarette and a beer. The children were singing and playing with their Christmas presents happily in front of the fire, and their excited shrieks can be heard from upstairs. Anne was baking a cake for after dinner, and Jean and Marie would be expected later. These people weren't family, but they made associations like this more than special. No one had ever been more supportive or like a second father than Philip. He was a very good special person to both her and Jack. After sitting down of an evening meal of chicken and potatoes and Anne's homemade apple pie, Philip and his family headed home, leaving Jack and Rose alone. It had been a long day of celebrations, and they were both so very tired. Sitting on the sofa in front of the warm, flickering fire, Jack held out his hands to Rose. She sat beside him and sighed contentedly, leaning her head against his shoulder. He began to gently stroke her hair, something he knew she loved. "I'm so tired," Rose yawned. "I know, darling. It's been a long day of fun," Jack laughed. "Those kids are certainly a handful," Jack sighed heavily, referring to Zach's 3 sons and a daughter. "I know they are, but they are dear, pretty children, very polite and kind. They have good manners, Jack." Rose tried to sit up, feeling discomfort. Jack held her hand and helped her. "God, I feel like a huge whale with my bump. I need help most of the time." Rose rubbed her temple. Feeling a bit of a bad headache began to come on. She ached everywhere, especially her breasts were very tender and sore. "Hey, it's all worth it though, right? Yes, you have a bump, but that doesn't make you any less beautiful than in my eyes. I have to say, I happen to think pregnancy is a very magical thing, and you've bloomed beautifully, not just throughout being pregnant, but I mean as a woman. Gone as a split, wilting flower you once was, you have become very independent, beautiful young woman with a fiery, wild, adventurous spirit, which you'll pass on to your children." Seeing the tears well in her eyes, Jack then leant forward and kissed gently on her lips. Usually she was hesitant, but this time she wasn't, for it was her who had deepened with the kiss. Lightly, he pulled away and kissed her around her face and then her neck. Rose could feel the pulse racing like if she had only been once before, but she knew that they would have to wait before anything like that happened. They had only made love once, and they would wait until the baby was born and Rose was fully comfortable to enjoy it before they did it again. Jack pulled Rose closer to him in a loving embrace. I know this year has been hard. Being honest, I thought I would lose you at one point. I thought you didn't like the way we lived and we would go back to Philadelphia to your mother. But you didn't. You stayed. I would never go back, Rose stated sharply. Never, not now, ever. This is where I belong, with you and our family. But what about your mother? Jack asked, treading carefully, knowing her hatred of this subject. I know she wasn't very pleasant, but she is your mother. Maybe if she knew she was soon to be a grandmother, would she come around a bit? Rose released herself from Jack's embrace and sat forward. She thought of it carefully. She really would want her mother to be a part of her life again. She loved her mother, even though she wasn't a very nice woman at times, but the way she had treated her at the time aboard the Titanic and before was unforgivable. Her selfishness, her care for only herself and society, she didn't even have an open mind to anyone who didn't have money was trash to her. But how would Ruth DeWitt Boltaker react? To find out that her daughter was alive and well, married to the gutter rat she distressed herself so much, or the fact that her grandchild was a child of two people living in downtown New York, barely earning enough to support themselves over a week. Rose thought of it carefully. She would still choose the path of her life no matter what. Yes, society has given her the choice, clothes, the food, the luxury, but never bought of her happiness or love. She was controlled, used, and expected to sit perfectly, but Rose was one person who could never do that. This life wasn't the best, but it was enough. She had the necessities and her husband, and she counted herself as lucky. I would like to see my mother maybe one day, to talk to her. I hope she is all right and comfortable. I'm sure the Hockleys would have been taking care of her after I left, but not now or in the future. Those memories are still too fresh and painful to face again. I need time, more time to heal before I face any of that again. Jack nodded, agreeing. He held out his arm and she leaned it back to him. She closed her eyes and rested them, but was asleep within minutes. Her chest rose and fell gently as she muttered in her sleep. Jack could tell she was dreaming, slowly arranged a pillow, and leant against it, before covering her up with a blanket that she had knitted for him as a Christmas gift. He sat beside her and kissed her hand softly, before placing it over her swollen stomach. A small smile appeared on Rose's sleeping face, and Jack thought of how lovely she looked. He thought of drawing her, but he knew it wouldn't come to him. Since the night the Titanic sank, his gift had faded every time he tried to draw. He failed miserably, screwing up the paper and throwing it in the bin, irritated. I could try, I suppose, he thought. Going to find his drawing materials, he had returned a minute later and positioned himself in a perfect place where he could see his wife's lovingly sleeping face and well enough to draw. Sighing, he put the charcoal to the paper and glanced at Rose. Slowly he started with strokes, but then the lines, and then he thought of himself to detail. He was surprised just how naturally it came to him, and before he knew it, he was sketching right away, like he never stopped. The early days of January 1913 passed as Jack was set out to work in early morning and returned at 6 sharp every evening before he would then cook dinner. As Rose was too weak to stand, her days were spent were reading or writing in her diary. Anne would call around a few days a week, so she wasn't very lonely. But now she was courting a man named Earl, who had met at the park just after New Year, and always telling her stories about him and his travels. The days when Anne wasn't there were lonely for Rose. She wasn't capable of much hatred, so depended on the people. But that would change within just a few days. A little baby would soon be here and would need her to depend on. Her discomfort grew by the hour, and it seemed so did her mood swings. She was dying to give birth. just to be comfortable again, and was more anxious than ever to meet the little one. On January the 18th, Jack left about 7 in the morning for work as usual. He kissed Rose goodbye and told her he loved her, as he always did every morning. She was growing more and more worried now. By the day about Rose, he absolutely hated leaving her, but he was only a few blocks away, and he had just begun to check up on her on lunchtimes, as she was always in bed, sleeping peacefully. Walking to work, Jack could feel the winter's cold or chill wrap around his body. He pulled his scarf further around his neck and picked up his pace. A day now he would be a father. He himself would have to admit, didn't know the first thing about being a father, but he just remembered how good of his father was on his own, and then he knew he would be the same. He couldn't wait to hold his little girl for the first time, since Rose announced that she was pregnant. He had a feeling that it was going to be a little girl. Another firecracker in the family. He could imagine her perfect little angel face, hair as fiery as her mother's. Arriving at Phillips, he immediately smelt smoke from the pipe, and he opened the door. "Good morning, Jackie boy," Phil greeted, pouring a tea into the pot. "Would you care for some tea, lad? Warm you up on this cold damn morning?" Jack nodded eagerly, rubbing his hands together in an attempt to warm them before removing his coat. "How is Rose doing this morning?" Phil asked, pouring the teacup in and stirring it gently. Jack took a chair and waited for Phil to sit and hand him the teapot. "She's all right, thanks. I left her in bed again. I hate leaving her, Phil. Just hate it. But I know I have to support my wife and child. It's just I'm worried about her." Philip sat back beside Jack, who had just become like a son to him in the past 9 months. "Hey, lad, when Joan was expecting my 3 girls, she was the same, and I was the same. I wake up every morning, kiss her goodbye, and my heart was ripping open. I worked on a farm a few miles away, and every morning I walked there and back, leaving behind my missus. Of course, when Anne was born, I stopped working for a few months. My boss was very generous and bloke me and gave me a few months' wages in advance, so I could spend time with my family." Jack smiled. Wow, he took his tea and began to blow it gently, then sip it, feeling the warm liquid in his insides. "Well, has it sunk it yet, lad?" Phil asked, offering Jack a cigarette. He refused and had just become used and not smoking due to Rose's pregnancy. "What has what sunk in?" Jack asked. "That you're going to be a daddy?" Phil asked with excitement in his voice. "It has, but I'm just scared for the next part. What if I fail? What if I can't handle it well?" Jack's voice was worried for the first time. "When Joan was pregnant with Anne, here's a secret, lad. I was 20 and she was 19, and she fell pregnant when we only been courting for a few months. Her dad found out and made us marry at once. I mean, yeah, I like this girl. She was a cracker. Long black hair, big green eyes, very pale skin. But man, did all the men fell at her feet. When she picked me up and I nearly died, she was a stunner, and I was a rouge, lad. I didn't want a kid or to be married. I thought why I married this girl when I could be out in bars drinking and gambling or into labor. I panicked. I nearly did a runner. I went to the bar, got steaming drunk, and fell asleep on the shop floor. Woke up the next morning stinking like a brewery. So I thought to myself, you know, lad, you're a father now. So I went home and had to wash myself, walk into my bedroom, where my wife and child was. Joan was asleep. Poor thing was exhausted. It was a long labor. But in that corner of the crib was my little Anne, 6 pounds and 6 ounces, with a head full of hair, as black as her mother's. I heard gargling and throwing at her tiny feet and fist in the air. So I bent down and picked her up, and I did. At that moment, she opened her eyes, and her little fingers squeezed my thumb so tight. And at that moment, it all fell into place. I was a daddy, and my little girl needed me, just like yours needs you. Phil slapped Jack on the back. It's hard, lad, very hard. The hours of long, sleepless nights, but it's all worth it, because I watched my Anne grow into a fine young woman, and she is now. I don't regret marrying Joan. I never will. God rest her soul. If she was here by now, she'd be fussing over you like a rash. But you and Rose are your family now, and I always wanted a son, and I got one and another daughter in the process. You just do it right by Rose and your baby, and you won't fail. I swear. Phil left the room, leaving a trail of smoke behind him. Jack didn't know any of this stuff that Phil had told him before. It made him realize everything seems to fall into place. He knew it would be a hard slog for him and for Rose, but they make it. One day he'd like to take Rose over to Santa Monica and head to the pier. It was still his dream. It seemed far away at first, but it was getting closer and closer now. Early in the morning sunlight poured through the curtains of the Dawson house. Rose yawned and stretched out before pulling herself out of bed. She made a decision to stay in her nightclothes all day. Maybe she would be more comfortable. Walking to the vanity unit, she brushed off her copper hair softly and left it to hang below her shoulders. It was 2 days now before she was due to give birth, and the anticipation was even more than ever. She hated that Jack was leaving throughout the day, and she was terrified of going into labor on her own. But it had to be done. Marie was due to call around this afternoon to bring Rose some tea cakes that she had baked the day before, especially for her. One of the things Rose missed was baking and cooking. It was something she was proud of learning herself. At around midday, the door opened, and Marie's happy face came waltzing in. She had very long, mousy brown hair, chopped to her shoulder length, and Rose had to admit that she looked better for it. Marie was just like her father down at tea. The eyes, the nose, the face shaped, the hair, even the way she laughed, but her mouth always guessed that was from her mother. Marie then set the tea cakes on the counter before giving a hug to Rose. Offering Rose a tea cake, she took one. "How are you today, Rosie?" Marie asked, setting herself up on the sofa. "I'm fine," Rose replied flatly. "Sorry about the nightdress." Rose indicated the nightdress she was wearing and apologized. "It's fine, honey. I understand. How's the tea cakes?" Marie questioned. She loved hearing Rose's views on her cooking, and it was something they both had in common. "Delicious," Rose replied with a mouthful. She grinned slightly. "It's so nice to taste something so good. I haven't ate anything tasty in weeks." Jack did most of the cooking and around the house lately, and to be honest, he wasn't the best cook. Simple things he would handle. But the main evening of dinner was sometimes either under or overcooked, sometimes even burnt. But it was something they laughed about. Finishing off her tea cake, Rose reached out to hand Marie a help from the sofa. On doing this, she felt a sudden burst inside and wetness between her legs. Then reality sunk in. Her water has broken. Marie! Oh God! Rose panicked. Not now. She was alone. She needed Jack here. "What's wrong, Rose?" Marie gasped, seeing afraid. "My water's broke. Marie, oh God, Jack!" The room began to spin as she panicked even more. No, sit down. Marie attempted to calm her down. "Now you sit down and I will run and get Jack. Then I will return here with the doctor, all right? I'll run now and get Jack," Marie yelled. Grabbing her coat, Rose nodded absent-mindedly, attempting to take all of this information. "Hurry," she uttered, as Marie slammed the door in a rush. At work, Jack was just finishing up before lunch. Business had been slow today, but he was sure ready for a sandwich when he could hear a woman's voice, shouting his name in the distance. Thinking he was hearing things, he carried on, humming to himself. He was sure worried about Rose, though. He heard another shout again. This time it was plainer. Glancing behind him, he saw Marie running towards him. His stomach knotted. "Jack!" she shouted, so out of breath so she could barely speak. "What is it, Marie?" Jack questioned hurriedly. Marie panted vigorously. "What is this?" Jack asked it in a sharper tone this time, grabbing her coat. "Rose," she managed. "Labor. Her water's broken." That was all Jack needed to know. As soon as he heard those words, he began to sprint right away in the direction of his home. "I'll fetch a doctor," Marie shouted after him. Upon reaching home, Jack was so out of breath, but he didn't care. He needed to get to Rose. He needed to see her, to soothe her. to help her through this. He rammed the gate open and ran inside through it. Upon reaching the door, he stopped for a few minutes, just to take all this in. He slowly opened the door and saw Rose, who immediately reached his arms for him. Their lives were about to change forever. Another pain ripped through Rose's abdomen. It had been 6 hours since she went into labor, and still hasn't given birth yet. Soon is all the doctors kept saying. Rose would curse them every time. The pain was unbearable. Her night dress was soaked in sweat, and the doctors wouldn't let Jack into the bedroom where she would give birth until Rose had yelled at him to do so. So Jack sat beside Rose, dabbing her soaking forehead with a cold, damp cloth. He wished he could take away her pain, just to go through the pain himself for her, but he knew he couldn't do that. All he could do was attempt to soothe her. She gripped his hand each time another pain ripped through her. The doctor sat downstairs, drinking tea and playing cards with Philip, so he would check on her hourly. The nurse who would sit outside would come in if needed. It was like a social event, not the birth of his child, but he felt like he just delivering the baby himself. He wanted all to be over and for this child to be laid in his arms. The labor was grueling for them both. Jack had yelled at the doctor more than once to hurry it along, but he knew there was nothing he could do but wait and let nature take its course. The anticipation grew within the passing hours. He just wanted to take it all away from Rose's pain, and he could not wait to meet his child. 7 hours after 13 hard, grueling hours of labor, Rose pushed their little girl into the world. At 1:03 a.m., weighing about 6 pounds and 11 ounces, their daughter was finally here. The nurse had took her from the doctor to clean her up and wrapped her in several pink blankets. Then she handed her to Rose, who was crying hysterically with tears of happiness. As soon as she laid the eyes on the beautiful baby in her arms, and at that moment, she all knew of the pain, the discomfort, and from the bleeding was all worth it. Jack smiled through his blurry eyes. He was weeping. He looked at his daughter, just minutes old, with her strawberry blonde curls, big beautiful blue eyes, and she was going to be a little firecracker. Her mouth opened and wailed loudly. This amused Jack. Well, looks like things aren't going to be quiet around here anymore, Rose smiled. Would you like to hold her? Rose asked quietly, carefully removing the blanket from around her daughter's face. She knew how much her husband had wanted a daughter. Yes, Jack answered. Rose carefully handed the bundle to her husband, who peered at his daughter. Wow, he gasped in awe. She's so perfect. Jack could feel his body just melt around her. She laid in his strong arms, protected forever. Positioning herself in the more comfortable position, Rose nodded. I know, she whispered. She's so amazingly perfect. She's all you, you know. She looks just like you. She's gorgeous, Jack whispered. He knew his daughter was drifting off to sleep. She yawned and waved her fists in the air before setting back down. So what are we going to call her? Jack asked. Then Rose didn't answer him before. Glancing up, he knew why. She was asleep. He smiled happily as he was so proud of her. After 13 hours of pain, she looked amazing. There was a saying that a woman looked her very best after giving birth, and it was true with Rose. He felt the blanket move again, and his daughter moved in the pink blanket. A small cry escaped from her lips as she opened her pretty little eyes. Hello, Jack said. He whispered lovingly. He ever so gently stroked his daughter's pink cheeks as she waved her hand again in the air. He held his thumb out and suddenly wrapped her tiny, chubby hand around his fist ever so tightly. It was then he knew it sunk in. Everything was cleared, just like it did with Philip. He was a daddy, and she was his child. She closed her eyes once more and began to drift off to sleep again. His eyes scanned her little face. She was certainly going to be a little heartbreaker when she was older. I love you, Jack whispered to his daughter, before glancing up at the sleeping Rose. His family was now complete.